Hi, 10th grade students. I'm here to talk with you today about close reading. Close reading is a particular type of analysis, a technique that you use to analyze literature. Throughout this year, we've written essays that are scholarly in nature, where you have used external sources and research to analyze works of literature after we've read them as a whole. And normally you derive your quotes from the work of literature from throughout the work, looking at the progress of themes, symbolism, imagery, and using the whole work to discuss your particular viewpoint. In a close reading, you take a small portion of the work, perhaps a paragraph or two, or at most a page or two, and you do close analysis of the context, the character interactions, the plot, and particularly the language to discuss major themes in the work as a whole. So in this particular writing assignment that you're going to be doing for me for our final semester assessment, you are going to be choosing a short passage to execute a close reading of. And I'm going to demonstrate for you in this video some of the ways that you can do a close reading. So I'm going to be using our copy of the Great Gatsby, and you'll recall that I'm using the Simon Schuster edition, and yours might be slightly different. If that's the case, that's fine. Just make sure you let me know what page numbers you're using. And I'm going to be using a passage that occurs at the beginning of the novel. This is in Nick's first encounters with the Buchanans, and it's found on pages 12 and 13 in this Simon Schuster edition. So in a close reading, you begin with the plot context. So you're going to introduce the passage that you're using by talking about what's going on in the scene, setting the scene for your reader. In this scene, we have a dinner party where Nick Carraway, who has recently arrived at West Egg and recently arrived in New York, is visiting his cousin Daisy and Daisy's husband Tom, who he knew in college. Tom is showing us his character in this dinner party. And so I'm choosing this passage as a particular passage that provides a window into what Fitzgerald is saying about 1920s society, and also how he's criticizing the point of view of some aristocratic people in America represented by Tom Buchanan. So the passage begins at the bottom of page 12. "Civilization's going to pieces," broke out Tom violently. "I've gotten to be a terrible pessimist about things. Have you read The Rise of the Colored Empires by this man Goddard?" "Why, no," I answered, rather surprised by his tone. "Well, it's a fine book, and everybody ought to read it. The idea is, if we don't look out, the white race will be utterly submerged. It's all scientific stuff. It's been proved." "Tom's getting very profound," said Daisy with an expression of unthoughtful sadness. "He reads deep books with long words in them. What was that word "Well, these books are all scientific," insisted Tom, glancing at her impatiently. "This fellow has worked out the whole thing. It's up to us, who are the dominant race, to watch out, or these other races will have control of things." "We've got to beat them down," whispered Daisy, winking ferociously toward the fervent sun. "You ought to live in California," began Miss Baker, but Tom interrupted her by shifting heavily in his chair. "This idea is that we're Nordics. I am, and you are, and you are, and—" After an infinitesimal hesitation, he included Daisy with a slight nod, and she winked at me again. "And we've produced all the things that go to make civilization. Oh, science and art and all that. Do you see?" There was something pathetic in his concentration, as if his complacency, more acute than of old, was not enough to him any more. When almost immediately the telephone rang inside and the butler left the porch, Daisy seized upon the momentary interruption and leaned toward me. I'm going to stop there. It's a short moment. It's a minor moment, but it's a powerful one, and you want to, in a close reading, pay careful attention, like I said, to the plot, the characters, the character interactions, and then the language itself. So begin at the bottom of page 12. Tom and his vehemence, his violence. Civilization's going to pieces, he insists. Well, let's think about the larger context of this time period. The novel was published in 1925, and it's set in the 1920s, which we discussed as a time when American society was changing in rapid ways. Women's roles in society were changing. World War I had meant that women had greater access to education and work life, and they had greater freedom, especially romantically. You also have the changes in society that are occurring with the rising middle class and the rise in wealth. And Tom feels angry. He feels threatened. Tom Buchanan represents the aristocracy, the moneyed, wealthy class in America that's being overtaken, as he sees it, by these other interlopers, these other groups. And in the 1920s, a lot of politicians expressed this type of viewpoint. In the novel My Antonia by Willa Cather, the author Willa Cather talks about the fear of immigration that a lot of politicians felt in the 1920s. And in fact, in 1924, American politicians passed an immigration act, a comprehensive immigration act, that limited the numbers of peoples and the types of peoples that could come into the country. We also had various American presidents in the early 20th century expressing similar viewpoints. So this view that he expresses violently and really in a humorous way, we have both the characters of Nick Carraway and Daisy kind of mocking him and looking at him and winking side-eyed at each other, that he sounds ridiculous. We have him representing, though, a real substantial viewpoint in American society. It also represents this interplay between the people who don't take Tom seriously, but do so at their own peril, because Tom is violent. He's violent in his viewpoint, and he silences Daisy. He silences Jordan. He isn't interested in hearing from anyone else, and he is the most powerful character in the room in terms of society and social expectations, social class. So some of the particular phrases that I would pick out and discuss if I were writing a close reading about this passage. Like I said, I would talk about the way that Tom breaks out violently, this word choice that Fitzgerald has when he talks about this book. And then later, when Daisy is trying to interject, the sadness that she feels and the way that he cuts her off at the top of page 13. She says, "What was that word we..." And then Tom interjects, "Well, these books are all scientific." He's not interested in what she has to say. He expects her to be a traditional wife, a wife that will remain silent and not express her viewpoint. And then I would also spend time talking about the language that Jordan uses, how she feels as though she can interject. "You ought to live in California," she interjects. She has views too. She represents this modern woman that's emerging in 1920s America. The notion of the book being scientific, I find that to be very interesting. He tries to prove his point by saying it's scientific. Another new idea in the 20th century, something that's emerging in 20th century America, justifying your viewpoint not by religion, but rather by science. And then lastly, I would look at Nick's assessment of Tom's character. There was something pathetic in his concentration, as if his complacency, more acute than of old, was not enough to him anymore. So Nick observes that Tom is bored. He's wealthy. He has nothing to do. And so he's filling his time reading these books and trying to express something that he thinks might be important, when in reality, he seems pathetic. And so I think all of the interruption, the ways that different conversations are interrupted, the way that different people are interrupted, expresses this interplay of power going on that happens throughout the novel, the larger theme of gender conflict, of power, the exchange of power, social class, and then, of course, the wealthy, moneyed classes and how dangerous they can be, as well as how pathetic they can be. So I hope this shows you how you might approach a close reading. You're going to be choosing one of the passages that I've provided for you, and you're going to first start with the plot and context, and then discuss the way that the characters talk to one another, how the characters are formed or shaped by Fitzgerald's language, and then look at the word choice itself. How do you see symbolism and themes represented in the language? I look forward to reading your close readings of The Great Gatsby.